بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين وحبيب رب العالمين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to grant us all the sincere intentions. Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, so not the Wahhabiyah, not the Shia, not the so-called Salafiyah. Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, the Muslims, those that follow the methodology of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, mentioned among them scholars like Al-Hafiz Al-Nawawi, like Muhammad Al-Fadali, like As-Sanusi, like Abu Hanifa radiyallahu anhu. These scholars mentioned that it is a personal obligation, that every accountable person knows the 13 attributes of Allah. Some said you must know 14. Some said it has to be 13 and some said 14. You have to know these things about Allah. Otherwise, if a person doesn't, then the very least is that a person would be a major sinner for having not known what Allah obligated for him to learn. So these 13 attributes were mentioned again and again in the Quran and in the hadiths of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. And also they comply with the intellect. So previously we mentioned a rule which was that we are not allowed, or nobody is allowed, to doubt about or deny any one of these attributes. No one can doubt about or deny. If they doubt, then they become a non-Muslim. If they deny, then they become a non-Muslim, because they have gone against the explicit texts of the Quran and they have gone against the intellect. This person, by denying one of these 13 attributes, it's as though he said Allah is not God. By doubting about one of these attributes, it's as though he is saying, I doubt if Allah is God. That's why the scholars said such a person becomes a non-Muslim for having gone against the core meanings of the two testifications, or the first testification of faith. So the scholars, they put these attributes, they looked at them in three ways. One category they called as-sifatun nafsiyah. Another category they called it as-sifat as-salbiyah. And a third category they called it sifatul ma'ani. So the first is as-sifatun nafsiyah. This is existence. This attribute has a category of its own. It is one attribute, existence, the existence of Allah. Allah exists. The second attribute is, or are, the second group of attributes, they are known as the negating attributes. They negate what does not befit Allah. The scholars mention here, هذه الصفات تنفي عن الله ما لا يليق به. Whatever is not appropriate, whatever is not befitting to be attributed to Allah, these attributes that we're going to mention now, they negate those things from Allah. For example, these attributes are oneness. This negates being more than one. Al-Qidam, eternity, not having a beginning. This negates having a beginning. Al-Qiyamu bin-Nafs, Allah is not in need. This negates being in need. Al-Mukhalafatu lil-Hawadith, Allah Ta'ala is not like the creation. This negates being like the creation. And these are as-sifat as-salbiyah. Sifatul ma'ani now, this is the third category. Sifatul ma'ani refers to some attributes now that are attributed to Allah. Why are they in this category and not in the other two? Well, the first category is a sifatun nafsiyah, that is the existence of Allah, meaning Allah Himself. This is the existence of Allah. The second category is a negation of being more than one, a negation of having a beginning, a negation of being in need, a negation of being like the creation. This third category, in it are attributes like the power of Allah, the seeing of Allah, and the sight of Allah, Allah sees, the hearing of Allah, the will, the knowledge of Allah. Likewise, Allah being everlasting. These attributes are known as sifatul ma'ani. And Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah speak about the attributes of Allah in this way. This is the knowledge of at-tawheed. This is the knowledge about Allah. Ahlul Sunnah, we do not speak about the attributes of Allah in the way that Ibn Taymiyyah innovated. Ibn Taymiyyah was the first person, and he is the one from whom the Wahhabiyah, the so-called Salafiyah, take their teachings. Ibn Taymiyyah was the first, or among the first people to say that at-tawheed, that the belief about Allah, is split up into three. So not the attributes of Allah, but rather the belief about Allah supposedly is split into three. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and Tawheed al-Asma' wal-Sifat. They said you cannot be a Muslim unless you testify to believe in these three types of Tawheed. The Prophet did not mention them, alayhi salatu wasalam, but Ibn Taymiyyah did. So, what we're mentioning now, as-sifatun nafsiyya and as-sifat as-salbiyya and sifatul ma'ani, this categorization, it is something that the Sunni scholars did, not people like Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya or the Wahhabiyya. No. This is the way of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. So let us speak about the first attribute of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. This first attribute, it is oneness. Al-wujud. Al-wujud in the Arabic language means existence. Al-wujud in some other languages can mean the skin. The skin. So this is not what is intended. What is intended by al-wujud is the Arabic meaning existence. So Allahu lahu wujud. Allah has an existence, meaning Allah exists. And it's important to know that Allah, His existence, is not like the existence of anything else. Yes, we exist. And this microphone exists. And we say Allah exists. But the existence of Allah is not like our existence. Because Allah mentioned, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. The existence of Allah is without a beginning, and the existence of Allah is without an end. In other words, it is eternal and everlasting. And Allah, His existence is not because someone created Allah. No. Our existence is because we were created. Our existence was initiated. We began to exist because Allah created us. Allah also exists, but it's obvious that His existence is not like ours because Allah didn't begin to exist. He has always existed. If somebody said, Allah began to exist, this would mean that something else brought him into existence. This would mean Allah was in need of the one that brought him into existence. Then how would one say that Allah, who is supposedly in need, how would one say that he is God? So Allah Ta'ala exists without a beginning. So in the Arabic language, you can say, Allahu lahu wujud, Allah has an existence. And you can say, Allahu mawjud. Some of the Wahhabiyya said, oh, you can't say Allahu mawjud. And this, we're not going to go much into this. Actually, we're not going to go into it at all. But the Wahhabiyya said that you can't say Allah mawjud because it goes against something in Arabic morphology. But no, this is not the case. They try to make a case of this. They say you can't say mawjood because it entails that something has been done to Allah and so on. But this is not the case. But this is a discussion that is not for this session. So you see, the Wahhabiyya, it's not that they've made one mistake by saying that Allah is in the sky, which takes them out of Islam. It's not that they've just made this one mistake. They've made many mistakes. And they've confused many people. The scholars in the past, like Muhammad Murtada al-Zabidi, who was known as Khatimatul Lughawiyin, the seal of the linguists, scholars of language. He said, Al-Bari'u Ta'ala, meaning Allah, mawjood. He used the word mawjood about Allah. And he is a linguist. He said, Al-Bari'u Ta'ala mawjood. Allah is mawjood, meaning Allah exists. That's all it means. So everybody has to know that Allah exists. If somebody, let's go back, if somebody doubts about the existence of Allah, then he is not considered a Muslim. Because Allah revealed in the Quran that إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, the Muslims are only the ones who آمَنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, they believed in Allah and the Messenger of Allah, ثُمَّ لَمْ يَرْتَابُوا, then they do not doubt about that. So doubting about the existence of Allah is kufr. Of course it is. What is more than that is to deny the existence of Allah. This also makes a person a non-Muslim. If a person had an active doubt, even if it was for a moment, about the existence of Allah, this person, even if they are sitting within the comfort of their own home, if they are driving to work, if they are on the bus, if they are walking in the street, if they have an active doubt about the existence of Allah, then this person falls out of Islam. The scholars mention that the heart does not contain both Iman and Kufr. It does not contain both belief and disbelief. They cannot coexist in the heart. If Iman enters, if belief enters, then Kufr exits. But if Kufr enters, then all of Iman exits. So if a person doubts about the existence of Allah, this person becomes a non-Muslim. As you know, such a person would need to repent immediately by saying, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. He would need to embrace Islam. The next attribute is al-qidam. Al-qidam means al-azaliyah, eternity. To be eternal in the English language carries two meanings, and both are correct. Usually, to be eternal means to be everlasting. But also, in the English language, in the classical English tongue, and it's used nowadays also, but less, eternal can be used to mean without a beginning. And this is what we here mean by Allah is eternal. Allah is eternal and He's everlasting. But here we're talking about the eternity of Allah, Allah being existing without a beginning. And this is exclusively for Allah. This attribute of being without a beginning, this is exclusively for Allah, meaning no one and nothing else is attributed with not having a beginning except Allah. Only Allah has this attribute. So the universe had a beginning. The skies had a beginning. The arsh, the first of creation, water, had a beginning. The prophets, the angels, the devils, everything had a beginning. Why? Because Allah gave it that beginning. Everything is in need of Allah. As for Allah, Allah mentioned Huwa al-Awwal. Huwa al-Awwal doesn't mean Allah is the first. Allah revealed Huwa al-Awwal wal-Akhir. It doesn't mean Allah is the first and the last. It means Allah is without a beginning and Allah is without an end. He is eternal and everlasting. Anybody who attributes to any creation that it exists without a beginning, then the scholars judge this person as a non-Muslim. There are some people in the past who claimed to be Muslims, and the scholars judged all of them as kuffar. There are some people who are known as al-falasifatul Islamiyun. These are philosophers who claim to be Muslims. Ibn Sina was a philosopher. Ibn Rushd, for example, and others amongst the people who claim to be Muslims. They claimed that the universe does not have a beginning. Meaning, they said the universe has always existed. To say that is an insult to Allah. To say that there is something in the creation that does not have a beginning, this is an insult to Allah. Why? Because it means Allah didn't create it. Because it means that this thing exists independently of Allah. This means that this thing that supposedly doesn't have a beginning, it exists and it is not in need of Allah. And to say that there is something that exists in this universe that is not in need of Allah, surely this is kufr. Surely this is kufr. So this is something that is not taught a lot anymore. That Allah exists without a beginning to His existence. And everything else exists with a beginning because Allah gave it that beginning. This is among the core matters of belief, among the core meanings of being God. God means the one who is attributed with these 13 attributes that we are going through. This is what al-uluhiyya is, godhood, being God. One of these attributes is that Allah Ta'ala exists without a beginning to His existence. And this is an idea that needs to be, that a Muslim needs to have in his mind, his heart, very firmly. What is that? That Allah is not weak. This is obvious. But also that if you attribute certain things to Allah, then you by definition would be saying Allah is in need and hence He is weak. So if a person attributes a beginning to Allah, or a person says, like if a person is asked, it comes up in conversation and a person says, I'm not sure, does Allah have a beginning or not? This person is not excused. This person has doubted about whether Allah is weak or not. Merely doubting about that. Merely saying, I don't know if Allah has a beginning or not. Like if someone says, how am I supposed to know? Does Allah have a beginning or not? I don't know. I was never told. If someone says, I don't want to go into it. And deep down, they don't know. They're hesitating. In all these cases, this constitutes doubt. And doubting about this matter is kufr. It's doubting about whether Allah is God or not. It's doubting about whether Allah is weak or not. It's doubting about whether Allah is in need or not. That's why the scholars judged it to be kufr. The scholars like Az-Zarkashi in his book Tashnif al-Masami' judged, or rather conveyed, the consensus of all of the scholars, the agreement of all of the Muslim scholars, that the one who says that the universe exists without having a beginning, then this person is a kafir. They said bil ijma'. They did not exclude anybody. Some of the philosophers said that the universe, it's always existed, and this is kufr. Some of them said, no, it hasn't always existed, but the kind of the universe has always existed. Like they said, humankind, the idea has always existed. That's not the case. Allah created humans. When humans came into existence, that's when humankind started to exist. Like humankind, let's say, if you talk about trees, tree kind, or the kind of this, the idea of skies, the idea of the arsh, the idea of the angels, right? So some of the philosophers, and this doesn't save them either, some of the philosophers said, the actual entities didn't exist, but the idea has always existed without a beginning. It's not true either. The Muslim scholars judged both groups of philosophers. Those who said that the entities have always existed, and those that said, no, not the entities, but the idea, the kind of the universe has always existed. All the scholars judged both these groups as kuffar. All of the scholars judged both these groups as kuffar. Someone who was very famously or infamously teaching this was Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was a person about whom many scholars said that Allah gave him a very strong memory. A very strong memory. So he memorized many religious texts, many hadiths, but they said that his mind was narrow, meaning his intellect was very small. So he started to read the books of the philosophers. We Muslims don't rely upon, when I say the philosophers, in philosophy they look at things like, they don't talk about the Quran, they don't talk about the hadith, they try to explain the existence of the world in other terms. They try to explain it in other terms. Like they'll talk about skies and skies before that. And they talk about very strange things that once a person starts to think like that, it's hard to come out of that. In some forms of clinical practice, in some forms, in some professions, in university, they instill this within the student to think in certain ways. They might call it critical thinking. When they sometimes speak about the ego, the id, and other things, sometimes what they do is they teach some people, and this is in some cases, they teach them a particular way of thinking, which is outside of reality. Al-Islam, the Prophet ﷺ brought to us knowledge that is apparent about the realities of things. And we don't delve and put up theories, and we don't do this. We judge things as they are apparent. But these philosophers, they look at things a different way. Once a person gets involved in that, then he would judge matters differently. Like one person, Ibn Hazm, who was a twisted individual. He claimed to be a Muslim. Ibn Hazm, because of studying the way he did, he ended up saying things like, and this is impossible. He ended up saying things like, it's possible that Allah would have a son, but he does not do it. This is a matter that's impossible. But the way that philosophers structure their arguments is that they might have one premise, 2, 3, or 4 different foundations, and then they would cross-examine, and then they would give what they believe to be possibilities. And a lot of times these can lead to kufr. Like, I'll give you an example of things that are ridiculous, that some people who studied philosophy, like Ibn Taymiyyah, said. So he said, for example, and this is impossible, it can never happen, okay, just so you know the answer before I say it. He said that it's possible that Allah would sit on the back of a mosquito. It's impossible that Allah would be in a place. But what led him to, who says something like that? He said also it's possible, and this is impossible. He said it's possible that Allah Ta'ala would touch or come into contact with najasat, filth, like feces and urine. And this idea of touch, it's not to be attributed to Allah. It's impossible. He said things like the universe is eternal. He said this, for example. Ibn Taymiyyah is the same person who was locked up so many times. He died in prison for the things that he said that were wrong in the creed, in belief. And then there were those matters, about 60 matters or more, that he went against the consensus in other than the belief. So it's not just in the belief. Then who carried on his teachings many hundreds of years later? The Wahhabiyah. The Wahhabiyah took his teaching. So he spoke about creed, he spoke about Allah. Him and his students, it's known from them, or from that route, that they taught that Allah has a limit, i.e. he's weak. But they said only Allah knows his limit. It's like saying Allah is in need, but only Allah knows how needy he actually is. All because of philosophy. All because of falsafa. So, point being, the books of the philosophers, one should not read. The scholars said, some of them said, يَجُوزُ الْإِسْتِنْجَاء بِكُتُبِ الْفَلَاسِفَةِ. They said you're allowed, because it's not a beneficial knowledge. You're not allowed to waste paper in a book, are you? You're not allowed to waste it. You're not allowed to burn something that's beneficial. You're not allowed to break something that's beneficial. But they said the books of the philosophers, as long as they don't have the name of Allah and so on in them, they said you can make istinja with them because they're not beneficial. The Muslim scholars did not consider them beneficial. Rather, they considered them like fire. They considered them to be very dangerous. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala exists, and he exists without a beginning. Saying otherwise is an insult to Allah. Saying that he has a beginning necessitates that he is in need, which necessitates that he is weak. How would the needy and the weak be God? So anybody who says Allah has a beginning, or I don't know if Allah has a beginning, then he truly has not believed in La ilaha illallah. That's why he is considered a non-Muslim. This is what the Sunni scholars said. This is what Ahlul Sunnah said. Ahlul Sunnah mentioned many details in this regard. But they did not excuse the person who denies that Allah is without beginning. They did not excuse the person who denies or doubts, is Allah without a beginning or he has a beginning? They did not excuse such a person. So Allah Ta'ala is necessarily attributed with being without a beginning. And Allah being without a beginning, it does not entail that periods of time lapsed upon Allah. We have a beginning, okay? Each and every one of us, okay? What about the creation? The creation must have started somewhere, whether it was a human or it was inanimate matter, like wood or metal or dust or whatever it was. It must have started somewhere. Do we know the answer to this question? The answer is yes. The Prophet ﷺ said, as was narrated by Al-Bukhari in his Sahih, كان الله ولم يكن شيء غيره. Allah existed and nothing else existed. Allah, who has always been attributed with his attributes, existed and nothing else existed. Then in another hadith, the Prophet mentioned alayhi salatu wassalam, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمْ يَخْلُقْ شَيْئًا مِمَّا خَلَقَ قَبْلَ الْمَاءِ. Allah didn't create anything before water, meaning water was first. So when the water came into existence, that's when places started to exist. That's when time started to exist. Before that, there was no time, because Allah made time, created time. So before the first creation existed, Allah existed. And there was no time. So how would someone say, oh, time lapsed upon Allah? How would someone say, for example, which is wrong to say, someone wouldn't be able to say, Allah waited for 700 years and then created creation. There was no time. There was no such thing as time. Can we imagine that? No, because we have only ever lived whilst periods of time lapse upon us. Seconds, minutes, hours, years. That's all we know. We cannot imagine something without time. If you imagine something in your mind, you might imagine it for a few seconds. You might see it quickly and then it goes away. Yeah, that's time. Time lapsed upon it. You cannot imagine anything without time lapsing upon it. Okay, what about Allah? Well, we know we can't imagine Allah. We know we can't imagine Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So the eternity, meaning the existence of Allah without a beginning, is not with the meaning of a passage of a long period of time. This is why we don't say about Allah that Allah is really old, because this denotes time, right? If you've had a car for 15 years, you say that's really old. A lot of time has passed on it. It's really old. But we don't say old about Allah, because time doesn't pass. Time doesn't lapse upon him. Time doesn't lapse upon Allah. And this is the consensus of Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. They said, Inna Allah Ta'ala la yajri alayhi zaman. Zaman, which is a zaman, time, it doesn't, la yajri, it doesn't lapse. It doesn't run upon Allah, because he created it. The belief of Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah is pure. Now, here is what I was touching upon. In Arabic, you can say Allahu Qadim. But Qadim here doesn't mean old. If you say in the Arabic language, هذا الحاسوب قديم. This computer is Qadim, it's old. مكبر الصوت, this mic, قديم, it's old. هذه القاعة قديمة. This hall is قديمة, it's old. But if you say about Allah that he is Qadim, as is mentioned in when the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the 99 names of Allah, in one narration he mentioned the name of Allah Al-Qadim. But we can't say that it means the old. Rather, it means the one without a beginning. Al-Qadim, when said about Allah, means the one without a beginning. So we say Allahu Azali, Allah is without a beginning. Allahu Qadim, Allah is without a beginning. As for the proof of the eternity of Allah, what's the proof that Allah has always existed? It's in the Quran, Huwa al-Awwal, that Allah doesn't have a beginning. Also, what is a proof is that had Allah not been eternal, he would have existed with a beginning, and thus he would be in need of a creator which gave him that beginning. And this would necessitate one of two things, ad-dawr or at-tasalsul. So when the Muslims went about explaining the beginning of the universe, creation, how did they do that? How did we do that? We took the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, that Allah existed and nothing else existed, no time, no place, nothing. And then Allah created creation. So creation has a beginning. Okay, how do some other people who are not Muslims seek to explain the beginning, or rather this life? How do they explain this life? Some will say, I don't know. Some will say, the universe has always existed. Some will say that. Some will say the universe has always existed. Not necessarily that humans have always existed. They'll say the creation is, or rather, they'll say the universe has always existed. Whether they talk about black holes or anti-quarks, antimatter, they'll say the universe has always existed. Some have said in the past that we don't exist. They have explicitly said, even though they are walking, talking human beings, they'll say we don't exist. So what did the Muslims do then to prove that Allah exists, and then to prove after that that Allah exists without a beginning and everything else exists with a beginning? How did they do that? They constructed two false theories. They did this on purpose. They brought about a model, is better actually. They constructed a model just to show these people that, look, what you're saying, it doesn't work. Something goes in one end, it doesn't come out the other end. It doesn't work. It's corrupt. So they constructed like this. They proposed two models. One model, they refer to it as ad-dawr. And one, they refer to it as at-tasalsul. One, they refer to it as the false theory of circles, the false theory of circles. And the other one, they call it the false theory of infinite regression. So if someone says Allah has a beginning, that's wrong. So that can only mean one of two things. The scholar said that can only mean one of two things. If someone said Allah has a beginning, meaning it must mean that something created Allah. So then either a person would say that, well, this thing was also created by something before it, and this thing was also created by something before it. If a person stops at one of these points and says, well, then this one created everything, then what would we say? We say that's Allah, right? But so we prove our point, Allah exists without a beginning. But if they want to keep going, like they said the universe has always existed, then they would have to supposedly infinitely regress, go backwards. back and back, and then they say, this one created this, and this one created this, and this one created this. They'd have to regress like this. The example the scholars give here is, or to give an example which would make sense, is when you have things stacked up, usually you see the dominoes, person flicks it, and then they all go. So from this side of the room, if we start, and they are stacked up like this, and the last piece is on that side. Imagine that last piece, okay, that represents our existence. Our existence. If it falls over, that means we exist, right? So let's say it has fallen over, which means we exist. Okay, so why does it fell over, which means the one before it fell over, and the one before it fell over, and like this? Doesn't it mean that there must have been one, the first one here, that fell over in order for that to fall over? Right. So what if somebody says that no, Allah, because some of them refer to Allah as not as the creator, but as a force. So they say this force, it was preceded by another force, and that by another, and that by another, and that by another, and that's how we exist. But we can't exist if there's no starting point. Like if you don't flick this domino here, that one's not going to fall. That makes sense? That one's not going to fall. So which means, however far back they go, it must have a beginning point for us to exist. Otherwise, what are we doing here? Otherwise, how is it that I'm here? That's why when some of the ignorant people, when the sophists, when they heard this proof, they said, well, we don't actually exist then. We're just hallucinations. We are just imaginations. They said, nahnu khayal. That's what we are. Because they couldn't go anywhere. They were cornered. It was said to them, well, if you're saying that we infinitely regress, there's no starting point, so that means we wouldn't exist right now. They said, well, you know what? You would imagine someone would say, look, I don't know what to say there. Or they'd say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. They embrace Islam, but they completely went the other way. They said, we don't exist. Ajib. They said we don't exist. So this is the so-called theory of infinite regression. There's another theory also, which is called the theory of circles. So a person might say, if someone was to say, well then, wal-'iyadhu billah, if they said Allah has a beginning, then that would mean that someone created Allah, which is not true. The first option we mentioned. The second option would be to say this. And then some people, they try to do the thing where they go around in circles, where they say, well, the creation created itself, or Allah created himself, or Allah had a creator that Allah created, but it created Allah. And they go around in circles like this. The best example to give here is the one about the chicken and the egg. What came first, the chicken or the egg? If someone says the chicken came first, they will say, well, where did it come from? Doesn't it need an egg? Doesn't it come from an egg? Someone said, fine, the egg came first. They would say, well, where did the egg come from? Doesn't a chicken hen need to lay an egg? So the correct answer to this is what? One of three. They're all correct. Either Allah created the chicken as it is, so it had a starting point. That's the whole point. It had a starting point. Or Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala created the egg first, or Allah created them both together. Do we know the answer to this question? I don't. But it doesn't matter. I mean, Adam alayhi salatu wasalam was the last type of creation that was created. The skies, the angels, the jinn, the animals were created beforehand. So there needs to be a starting point. So the scholars mention these two false theories to falsify the sayings of the atheists, the philosophers, and the sophists. So Allah Ta'ala exists. Allah Ta'ala is the only one that exists without a beginning. Likewise, Allah is everlasting. Allah mentioned Huwa al-awwal, meaning Allah exists without a beginning. It doesn't mean Allah is the first. Huwa al-awwal wal-akhir, meaning that Allah exists everlastingly, without an end. So Allah is everlasting. Allah Ta'ala is necessarily attributed with everlastingness, meaning that non-existence does not apply to Allah. We will die. Our life, it becomes non-existent. There's a cut-off point. Likewise, this world will end. The earth, it will be, or rather the sun, the moon, the things in this world, they will be rolled up in general and they will be hurled into hellfire. They will have an end. As for Allah, He has always existed and He will always exist. And this is confirmed firstly in the Quran. Allah revealed, Huwa al-akhir. Allah revealed, وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. Meaning that the that of Allah, the self of Allah, Allah. Wajhu Rabbik means Allah. It doesn't mean like the Wahhabiyya say the face of Allah or the countenance, any face of Allah. No. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ. Yabqa meaning to remain. Al-baqa. That Allah will remain. Allah is everlasting. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ. So firstly, it's in the Quran. Secondly, does the intellect bear witness to this? Does the intellect agree with this? Of course it does. Now, there are other things that we can say about that they are everlasting, but not in the same way as Allah. We use the same word. We say everlasting. Like paradise is everlasting, and the people within it will last forever. Hell is everlasting, and those that Allah willed, the kuffar within it, will remain there forever. And we say Allah Ta'ala also exists, and His existence does not have an end. What's the difference? The difference is nobody willed that for Allah, meaning Allah existed without a beginning and He exists without an end. As for the existence of paradise and hell, who willed that they would not have an end? Allah. Allah willed that they would not have an end. And their existence is not like the existence of Allah because they have a beginning. The scholars mentioned a rule. They said, Al-Qadim la budda an yakuna baqiyan. They said, the eternal, meaning only Allah. They said, the one that exists without a beginning, and this is only Allah, must exist without an end. This is a rule. You can't say the same for paradise because paradise and hell, in terms of them being a creation, they are weak. They are weak. They are limited because they were given a beginning. They are in need of Allah. There was a time, you look at paradise is a place. It's made up of a very large area. Time lapses upon it. Within it are pleasures, there are fruits, there is water, there is honey, there is milk, there are textures, there are scents and beautiful fragrances. All of these have been specified by Allah, and they will remain existing by the will of Allah. So paradise is always in need of Allah. Likewise, hell is always in need of Allah. So saying that paradise and hell are everlasting and saying Allah is everlasting, it's not the same thing. Our souls are everlasting, aren't they? Our souls, they do not cease to exist. Yes, we die. We die. But our souls will be everlasting. They will live on forever, either in paradise or in hell. We'll mention the next one, inshallah, and then we'll review it next time. We'll mention it briefly. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is attributed with hearing. Allah revealed in the Quran, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ. Allah is as-Sami'. Allah is all hearing. So we believe that Allah hears, of course. Someone might say, look, you always say that you Sunnis, you Ahlus Sunnah, you always say that Allah is not like the creation. We say, of course, this is the belief of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Then they might say, well, look, we have hearing, and you say Allah has hearing. We say yes. So they might say, isn't that saying that Allah is like the creation? We say no, because the hearing of Allah is nothing like the hearing of the creation. Okay? What do we, let me put it like this. What do we hear? It's obvious. What do we usually hear? Sounds. Right? We hear sounds. The hearing of Allah is not like this. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, or rather the scholars mentioned, Allah hears everything. Allah hears everything. Now, can we hear, I don't know, can we hear a smell? No. Can we hear a taste? No. Can we hear an extremely bright light? Can we hear it? No. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala hears everything that exists. So when we say hearing about Allah, this is not specific to sounds. If someone said Allah hears like we hear, right? He hears like we hear, which means he only hears sounds and he hears with an ear, he hears through sound waves, then this would obviously be kufr. But we can say hearing about Allah because there is a type of hearing that is nothing like the creation. However, when the Wahhabiyya say that Allah has a hand, we say this is kufr. Some might say, well, isn't this the same? Isn't it the same for the Wahhabiyya to say Allah has a hand, and you also say that Allah Ta'ala, you also say that we have a hand? Isn't that like saying Allah hears and we hear? We say no, because when we say Allah hears, there's a type of hearing that is nothing like the creation. Hearing doesn't have to be what we understand it to be. There is a type of hearing that is not related to sounds. It's not related to ears and sound waves. But hands, there is no literal hand that means other than this. Hand always means a volume, a limit, a need, fingers, palm, back of the hand, bones, flesh. This is the meaning of hand. This is why you can't use it about Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So I might say, oh, but doesn't hand metaphorically mean power? Yeah, it does. But the Wahhabiyya say you've got to be literal. And literally, this is a hand. So you can't say Allah has a hand, but not like our hand. Can't say that. You can't say Allah has a face, but not like our face. You can't say that either. You can't translate these words that Allah attributed to Himself literally. And we'll go more into that inshallah next time. But Allah hears absolutely everything that exists. Allah hears absolutely everything that exists. The intellect does not deem it impossible to hear something that is not a sound. The intellect does not deem it to be impossible to hear something that is not a sound. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has eternal speech, which is not a sound. But the scholars mentioned that Musa heard the speech of Allah. And the speech of Allah is not a sound. In the same way, everything that exists can be seen. Even if we can't usually see it. Can we see sounds? No, not usually. Can we see tastes? Can we see smells? Everything that is seeable, or everything that exists, Allah sees. Everything that exists, Allah hears, tabaraka wa ta'ala. So the seeing of Allah, the sight of Allah is not like ours, our seeing when we see. And the hearing of Allah is not like our hearing. This is the belief of all of the Sunni Muslims. Every single Muslim who is from Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. So not the Wahhabis, not the so-called Salafiyah. No, every Sunni Muslim, this is their creed, that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is attributed with these 13 attributes, and that they are not like the attributes of the creation. Okay. Unless there are questions, we'll stop here. Is there anything that was unclear? Okay, let's say La ilaha illallah and as-salah ala nabi. La ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.